We are often told that history is a straight line, a linear progression from the primitive to the advanced, written clearly in the ink of textbooks and the stone of our monuments. We walk through our cities with a sense of permanence, believing that the ground beneath our feet has always been there, solid, unchanged, and reliable. But what if I told you that the history of our cities is not written in the sky, but buried in the dark? Take a walk through the historic districts of Chicago, London, Paris, New York. Look closely at the architecture of the 19th century. You will notice a recurring, almost maddening anomaly: beautifully crafted windows, cut in half by the sidewalk, ornate doorways that lead directly into a concrete wall, entrances that require you to walk down a flight of stairs to enter what we are told is a basement, yet possesses the high ceilings and grand archways of a main lobby. Architects do not design windows to look into the dirt. Builders do not craft grand entrances, only to bury them. These are not design choices. These are scars. They are the visible tips of a colossal secret that suggests our civilization is built, quite literally, on top of the ruins of a previous, forgotten world. We are not talking about a few inches of dust settling over time. We are talking about entire first floors, sometimes second floors, swallowed by a sudden accumulation of soil. Something happened, something massive, swift, and global. And today, we are going to dig it up. Our investigation begins in the Pacific Northwest, in the city of Seattle. If you open the official archives and look at photographs from the late 1800s and early 1900s, you are immediately confronted with a landscape that defies logic. It looks less like a city being built and more like a city being excavated. Imagine standing on a street corner. To your left is a stately brick building, fully occupied, teeming with life. But to your right, rising vertically like a cliff face, is a wall of earth, 20, 30, sometimes 40 feet high. The buildings seem to be drowning in a sea of solid ground. In some photographs, we see houses perched precariously on top of tall earthen spires, looking like stranded ships left behind by a receding tide. The ground level is chaotic, uneven, and frankly, terrifying. The history books have a convenient explanation for this. They call it the Denny Regrade. We are told that city engineers, led by a Mr. R.H. Thompson, decided to level the steep hills of Seattle to make the city more flat and buildable. On the surface, this sounds like a standard, albeit ambitious, infrastructure project. But when you look at the method they used, the official story begins to crack. To move these millions of tons of earth, they did not primarily use steam shovels or dynamite. They used water. Photographs show men operating massive hydraulic cannons, known as monitors. These were weapons of industrial warfare, blasting high-pressure jets of water directly into the towering walls of earth that surrounded the city. Now, pause and think like an engineer. turning millions of cubic yards of soil into wet, heavy, flowing mud right in the middle of a populated city is a logistical nightmare. Mud is heavy. It clogs machinery. It spreads disease. It is uncontrollable. Why would you turn your city into a swamp voluntarily? Unless the material they were trying to remove wasn't just simple dirt. Let's travel north to the gold fields of Alaska during this exact same time period. Miners there were facing a unique problem. They needed to get to the gold, but it was locked beneath the muck, a frozen layer of permafrost, gravel, and ice. You cannot dig permafrost with a shovel. It is as hard as granite. So, what did they use? They used hydraulic monitors. They used water cannons. The high-pressure water wasn't just for moving the earth. It was for thawing it. The friction and the temperature of the water melted the ice matrix, turning the frozen ground into a slurry that could be washed away. Now, bring that image back to Seattle. Why would Seattle engineers use a technique specifically designed for melting permafrost in a temperate coastal city? Look at the official terminology again. The hills they were removing were often referred to as glacial hills. Historians say this refers to geological formations from the last ice age, thousands of years ago. But what if glacial was a literal description of their condition in the 19th century? This leads us to a terrifying hypothesis. What if Seattle was hit, not by a slow accumulation of dirt, but by an ice tsunami? Imagine a cataclysmic event in the ocean, a massive displacement of water carrying not just liquid, but shattered ice, seabed shelf, mud, silt, and pulverized debris. This slurry crashes into the coast, burying the streets, the houses, the entire lower infrastructure of the city. Then it stops, and because it is packed with ice, it freezes. It creates a flash permafrost that encases the bottom floors of the city in a frozen tomb. This explains why the buildings were buried. It explains the massive volume of material, and most importantly, it explains why they had to use water cannons. They weren't just moving dirt, they were melting the aftermath of a catastrophe. They washed the slurry down into flumes and dumped it into Elliott Bay, effectively erasing the evidence of the disaster and creating new real estate on the waterfront. For Seattle, the enemy was water and ice. If we stopped our investigation here, we could sleep soundly tonight. We could tell ourselves that this was a freak event, a localized tidal wave that struck the coast, a tragedy, but not a mystery. But the evidence refuses to let us rest, because thousands of miles away, deep in the heart of the North American continent, we find the exact same crime scene with a completely different suspect. Welcome to Kansas City. This is a fortress of the plains. It sits nearly 900 feet above sea level. It is protected by thousands of miles of land on all sides. No tsunami, no matter how biblical in scale, could wash over the Rocky Mountains or the Great Plains To deposit 20 feet of mud here, it is physically impossible. And yet, the photographs from 1867 tell a hauntingly familiar story. We see massive stone structures, classic Greco-Roman architecture, buried up to their roof lines. There is a famous photograph of a building on a street corner in Kansas City. You can see the roof, you can see the attic windows, and then nothing. The rest of the building, the grand entrance, the first floor, the second floor, is gone, swallowed by the earth. Official history tells us the same tired excuse. Street regrading, paving work. But look at the scale. We are talking about 23 feet of burial. That is 4 men standing on each other's shoulders. Who builds a 3-story building only to bury the bottom 2 stories and call it a basement? And look at the terrain itself. In the early photos of Kansas, the ground does not look like the muddy silt of a flood. It looks loose. It looks dry. The landscape is rolling, undulating like the waves of a frozen ocean. And most disturbing of all, there are no trees. In a region that should be fertile, we see a barren wasteland. No old oaks, no ancient pines, just scrub brush and saplings, as if the entire biosphere had been recently stripped away. If water didn't bury Kansas City, what did? The landscape gives us the answer. The rolling dunes, the burial without destruction, the dryness. This bears the signature of the element of air. We are looking at the aftermath of a mega-scale dust event. We know what wind can do. We remember the Dust Bowl of the 1930s, when storms blacked out the sun and buried tractors in Oklahoma. But what if that event was just a tiny, weak aftershock of something much larger? Imagine a continuous, relentless bombardment of sand and soil from the atmosphere. Storm that didn't last for days, but perhaps for years. Unlike a tsunami, which hits with kinetic force and smashes buildings to pieces, a dust storm is gentle in its violence. It envelops. It piles up against the brickwork. It flows through the cracks. It climbs the walls inch by inch. It doesn't knock the building down. It preserves it. It creates a sarcophagus of soil. This explains why the buildings in Kansas City are still standing straight. They weren't hit by a wave. They were suffocated by the sky. We can see this happening right now in the modern world. Look at the village of Shoina in Russia. Located on the edge of the Arctic Circle, it is being slowly devoured by sand dunes. Residents have to crawl out of their attic windows because their front doors are buried under meters of sand. It is a slow-motion burial. Now, apply that mechanic to the entire American Midwest in the mid-19th century. A catastrophe that erased the ground floor of a civilization. So we have 2 different mechanisms. On the coast, the ice tsunami. In the interior, the dust apocalypse. But the reaction of humanity was the same. A desperate, titanic struggle to dig themselves out. We need to talk about the sheer, impossible scale of the excavation. The photos from the late 19th century show a civilization at war with the earth. We see steam trains running on temporary tracks laid right down the middle of city avenues, hauling endless train cars of dirt. We see conveyor belts, miles long, snaking through the urban grid, carrying the debris away. In Seattle alone, they moved enough earth to build the Great Pyramid of Giza several times over. And we must ask, why? Why go to this trouble? Why spend the equivalent of billions of dollars using primitive steam technology to dig out these lower floors? Why not just leave them? Why not pave over the mud, turn the first floor into a basement, and add a new floor on top? That would be easier. That would be cheaper. The fact that they worked so feverishly to remove this soil suggests something disturbing about the soil itself. If the Seattle hypothesis is right, the soil was a thawing, rotting sludge of biological debris and ice. You couldn't build on top of it. It was unstable. It was toxic. They had to remove it to survive. They weren't regrading the streets for aesthetic reasons. They were cleaning up a crime scene. This leaves us with the ultimate question, the question that keeps researchers awake at night. If Seattle was hit by ice and Kansas was hit by dust, and we see similar buried buildings in Russia, in Europe, in Australia, then we are not looking at isolated local events. We are looking at a system failure, a planetary reboot. What kind of event could trigger tsunamis on the coast and massive dust storms in the interior simultaneously? What could displace the oceans and strip the topsoil off the continents, all within a short window of time? Some speak of a pole shift, a sudden movement of the Earth's crust that would send the oceans washing over the land. Others speak of a cometary impact, throwing enough dust into the atmosphere to block the sun and rain dirt down for a decade. Or perhaps massive volcanic eruptions that triggered a volcanic winter, altering the climate so radically that the biosphere collapsed. We don't know the exact name of the destroyer, but the scars are there. The buildings we call historic are actually survivors. They are the tombstones of a pre-cataclysmic world. The ornate architecture, the superior masonry, the impossible attention to detail. These were not built by people struggling with horse and buggy. They were built by a civilization that was settled, advanced, and unsuspecting. And then the lights went out, the mud came, the ice came, the dust came. When we look at old photos of the late 1800s, we often see people who look out of place. They stand in muddy streets, wearing ill-fitting clothes, surrounded by magnificent stone architecture that seems too grand for their primitive means. They look like squatters. They look like survivors who have inherited a kingdom they do not remember how to build and are busy digging it out of the mud. The official history books have smoothed over this rough period. They gave us words like regrading, urban renewal, raising the street level, comforting words, words that imply control. But the windows don't lie. The doors cut in half don't lie. The millions of tons of missing earth don't lie. Next time you walk past an old courthouse or a historic library, look down. Look at that window peeking out from the asphalt. Don't just walk past it. Ask yourself, what is down there? What is buried in the dark, waiting for us to remember? Because the truth of our history isn't written in the clouds. It is buried right beneath our feet.